Welcome to the Deep End by On Deck, a podcast where visionary builders, creators, and experts discuss world-changing ideas. I'm your host, Marshall Kozlov. Let's dive in. With the Deep End, we're creating a space where we skip the surface level and go in-depth into ideas that matter. I'll be your guide as we explore possible futures of commerce, higher education, art, governance, longevity, and more, with some of the most exciting figures in their respective fields. Joining me in the Deep End for the first of this week's two Deep Shorts is Webb Smith. Webb is an expert on consumer brands and e-commerce and the founder of 2PM, an online resource that analyzes the intersection of media and commerce. Today's conversation centers around the Vanishing Middle, which refers to the fact that brands are increasingly forced to appeal either to the working class or to the rich if they want to survive. We also discussed the broader ramifications of the vanishing middle and how it shapes the US beyond clothing brands, from how purchases are made to how towns are designed and much more. Webb believes the 2020s will echo the Roaring '20s, but instead of a decade, we will have just a few years to make the most of this unique moment in history. Two quick announcements for fans of the Deep End before we dive into the conversation. Last week, we launched our Substack where we share notes from our episodes and links to further reading and other announcements. The URL is thedeepend.substack.com. We'll also link to it in the show notes. We're doing our next live podcast recording on July 12th, this time with Packy McCormick, an ODF2 fellow and writer of the popular newsletter Not Boring. If you want to attend the recording, you can request an invite via the Deep End Substack. The Deep End is produced by On Deck, where top talent goes to accelerate their ideas and careers. We hope that those who listen to the ideas on the show are inspired to build. To learn more about On Deck's programs, visit beondeck.com. For show notes and additional resources related to the Deep End, check out ideas.beondeck.com. All right, let's dive in. Webb Smith, welcome to the Deep End.
Thanks for having me.
I want to start here because something I appreciate about your writing on e-commerce, the general business and technology spaces, is you place everything you're talking about in a really strong historical context. So when you think about the 2020s, which are off to a weird start, obviously, with the past year and a half of COVID, how do you consider them within the historical context of the Roaring '20s, the Spanish flu over 100 years ago, all that stuff?
That's always an interesting question. I think that the way that I positioned today was in a sense of optimism, with a sense of optimism. You know, coming out of 1919 and the Spanish flu, obviously took a few years to get going, but the Roaring '20s are legendary for investments in liquidity and for the growth of skyscrapers, for new industries, for even fashion, for leisure. And so I'm not going to say history repeats itself, but there are so many parallels that you could draw between the two periods, then and now, that it seems as though we are due for our own. And so far we're seeing that, whether it's the boom of sports books, NFTs, the growth of decentralized finance, endless liquidity with companies that you didn't expect to find liquidity anytime soon. I just heard a few days ago that Peter Thiel launched a company in May that's worth $20 billion and he's SPACing that, right? And it's just that there's so much, right? The difference between the two periods, I would say, is that whereas theirs lasted about 10 years, I feel like ours is going to last anywhere between 3 and 5. So it's more one of those situations where you want to get it while you can and hope for the best. I think that that's sort of the framework that I look at a lot of the current opportunity through.
What do you think is the 2020s equivalent of a skyscraper? Because I'm coming as a person from a general background, and I know NFTs and DeFi have all these amazing use cases, but I'm in New York. I could see the Empire State Building from my bedroom window, and nothing there really captures what I feel like skyscrapers were for someone back in the 1920s. So what do you think is the equivalent within your 3 to 5 year time frame?
You know, probably space travel. The ability for civilians to, frankly and ironically, reach the sky. I think Bezos is going up with Blue Origin in a few days. We'll see frequency in civilian air or space travel in the next 6 to 12 months. Over the next few years, it'll get less and less expensive for regular Americans to go up and touch space. And in that way, it's somewhat poetic, right? Between the two eras. Back then, skyscrapers were a technology that no one could have ever imagined, but thanks to steel, it made it possible. And so going to space as a normal person, something that none of us could have imagined. And, thanks to the innovation of a few key entrepreneurs, it's more than likely going to happen. Well, three. Bezos, obviously Elon Musk, and Richard Branson.
Yeah, Richard Branson gets left a little bit out there on a generational level. Getting to your own work, though, you've written that you think the e-commerce space specifically is one of the most exciting spaces to be in coming, knock on wood, out of the COVID moment. Sell your own book for a second, right? Like, what is exciting about e-commerce in this specific moment?
Yeah, I think when people think about e-commerce, they think about brands, right? I don't. I think about it as infrastructure. So, when you think about the late 19th century and railroads, or as we were talking about earlier, skyscrapers or bridges, even air travel, the Suez Canal, things that help to further mankind by bringing the world a little bit closer together. That's what e-commerce is to me. And eventually, all e-commerce principles will touch the vast majority of industries. So from telehealth to I don't know, the purchase of cars, it's all going to be influenced heavily or facilitated by the e-commerce industry. And so if you look at it through the lens of infrastructure, it's like, man, our entire way of living is changing. And the second order and the third order effects are far more interesting than the first, right? It's I'm a millennial, I guess. I'm an older one, but I never thought I would move to the suburbs. And one of the reasons I moved to the suburbs was because I wanted more space to work from home. And I didn't need to be in the city anymore to have the best economic outcomes. And Amazon now delivers groceries almost anywhere. So that convenience is still available even this far out of the city. So again, those are all facilitated by e-commerce principles, direct consumer, certain technologies, and logistics.
So can you actually talk about the principles? Because when I hear infrastructure and e-commerce, I think, hey, Amazon got me equipment for my mic within one day. But obviously, most companies aren't going to have Amazon's facilities or ability to deliver at that rate. So what are the principles that are going to broadly apply to a lot of different aspects of our lives then?
I think that obviously the Amazons and the eBays are of the top tier of e-commerce operators. But even if you look at like the FedExes and the UPSs, the things that USPS is doing, how commercial airliners are allocating more space to freight on their commercial flights, how companies like Uber and Lyft are modifying their business models to bolster last mile delivery. It seems everything is moving towards the direction of not having to go to a store to experience a purchase. And frankly, you have to dissect that with what's happening to the economy as a whole. And that is consumers are bifurcating, right? The rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer. The middle class is shrinking in that sense, which is both good and bad. We want a vibrant middle class, but I'm all for people getting richer. It sucks if people lose their footing, in my opinion. So in that sense, people don't need experiences in store to buy products, even nice ones anymore, right? I had a conversation with Ben Clymer, the founder of Houdinki, a few days ago, and he was saying something like, so luxury consumers, products aren't luxury, right? They're just things that people buy, right? Like if you want a Rolex, but you're wealthy, it's just a watch. You don't need to go through the whole song and dance in the store to buy that Rolex anymore because it's just a thing. Well, tone that down a little bit and think about expensive groceries or nice shirts or, expensive services that you could have imagined paying for 5 or 10 years ago online. It's the same thing. Even cars. It's like, if you know the car that you're getting, you don't need to go into the dealership and experience that car. It's just a thing. And I think e-commerce is going to benefit the subset of America where even the most expensive purchases are just things.
What do you think all this means for the suburbs? Because I grew up in suburbs. When I think of suburbs, I think of malls, going to the movie theater, the town square, all that stuff. And if we're actually going to articulate what all those things are, if you think of a Stranger Things nostalgia episode, that's all in-person retail, or at least walking around, going to those places. So what does this mean, you think, for the suburban experience that millennials like ourselves are going to remember, either pre-internet or dawn of the internet, where that was still much more in existence?
Well, I don't know how you grew up. I grew up squarely in the middle class, if not the lower middle class. So my suburbs weren't great. We lived out in Northwest Houston. We lived in one of those areas where the strip malls were so shitty that the architecture was different every block. The designs were sort of like jumbled together. It wasn't a beautiful place to live. In those middle class suburbs.
So like, I think of exurbs when you're describing that, right?
Yeah, it was, I tolerated it growing up. I'm like, oh, this can't be what life is. Like, I knew it even back then, even though I hadn't seen the other side. That retail is done, and there's nothing that's going to stop that. There's a figure I always throw out, and sorry if this is digressing too much, but America is over retailed by a factor of 40% when you even look at Canada, right? So we have 23.5 square feet per capita here. Canada, it's like 16. In Europe, it's 12. In China, it's 6. So we have 40% more retail per person than Canada. Almost double that than Europe. The vast majority of that crappy retail is in those same places where I grew up. And so if you go back there now, 40% of those spots are empty or are going out of business. And I'm not talking about that type of retail in the suburbs. What I'm talking about is what I call sanitized urbanization. So I live in a place called Dublin, Ohio, where they essentially built a downtown 30 miles outside of the city. And it's nice. It's everything that you would want in a downtown experience, but 30 miles outside of a city. The buildings, the bars, the walkability, the ability to drink outside, things that aren't customary of the suburbs that we grew up in, at least not the suburb I grew up in. That's going to flourish in America for the people that have the means to live in places like that. It's the middle class that's going to struggle in the retail that represents them.
What is that going to look like then, right? So if I'm thinking about what you're describing, I see luxury malls, right? So the type of malls that are kind of outdoors. There's a Tesla dealership. There's an Apple store. That's the high end. That's the class of mall that's going to succeed. What happens to the middle and the lower class? And I don't just mean at a class level, but just different levels and categories of malls. What happens to those?
Yeah, they crumble, literally. If it's a B or C tier mall, maybe they're redeveloped over time after years of struggle. If I'm not trying to get too dark, but you'll start to see violence. I mean, there's even one of those here in Columbus where in 3 weeks there are 3 or 4 gun incidents. And this is a mall that has a Lululemon in it. It's not a bad mall, but it's the type of mall that borders on class B / lower class A. And so the top 10 to 30% of class A malls they're untouchable. They're invincible. They're not going anywhere. In fact, they're going to get better. Then you have the strip malls for the working class, the Dollar Generals, the laundromats, the corner stores, depending on where you live. I call them corner stores. I'm not in New York. Obviously, they're bodegas for you guys. But depending on where you live, you're going to have those, and they're going to flourish because there's a large group of people that need those services. But it's the specialty retailers and the Barnes and Nobles and the Container Stores, those types of companies that are focused on middle America are going to continue to struggle. And as they struggle, it's going to change the landscape of certain parts of every city.
Something I wonder though, you've written about how a lot of the direct to consumer plays, especially from a venture perspective, haven't been particularly successful. And what I'm wondering is, hearing what you're saying, my reaction is, shouldn't we be funding a direct to consumer container store? Why do you see the bifurcated opportunities given the fact that the middle you're describing is getting eviscerated? Or maybe I'm misreading your diagnosis of the direct to consumer space after around 8 to 10 years. But
Well,
how do you think about that?
well, frankly, if I had to be honest, that diagnosis was probably expired. I mean, listen, going back to what we first talked about with the Roaring 20s, Roaring 20s 2.0, if you will, all the companies that had a hard time finding liquidity, they raised a ton of money, they followed the same playbook, they're all going public, or they're all SPACing, or they're all exiting now. So anyone that contended that they weren't well-positioned companies is somewhat wrong, including me. It's like any company that started seems to be finishing, just because of how much money is in the ecosystem right now. So like, that's what I mean about the next 3 to 5 years. Outcomes that we probably would have never imagined will happen with frequency because of how much money is floating around.
So that's fascinating, because to read between the lines here, it seems, and I probably was reading a pre-COVID piece of yours, the whole COVID advanced the world 5 or 6 years take, which is a bit of a cliche, but also means something. It seems like that level of a Deus Ex Machina event really moved the US towards almost, not quite, but Chinese level e-commerce adoption levels, which then gave runway for these companies. Is that a good way of summing up what happened? As in, these companies,
Well, they're not exactly.
Yeah, please.
They're not. They're not. Well, yes, I guess in some ways you're right. A lot of these companies did so well over the pandemic that it made them economically viable at the right time to potentially exit. The Warbies, Allbirds has always done well, but you didn't expect them to exit as soon as they seem to be planning to. Away is probably going to IPO. Those types of companies, right? Just 3 years ago, it was like, they raised a ton of money and they have no way of getting or finding liquidity for their investors. That was the prevailing narrative, right? So yes, COVID did do a lot to bolster the viability of these companies, because a rising tide raises all ships, and that rising tide is e-commerce, our primary means of retail for quite a period of time over that 15 months. And the companies that represent e-commerce, which are a lot of the Gen 1, Gen 2 direct-to-consumer brands. Even the Gen 3 ones, the ones that started in the last 2 years, went from 0 to 60 really fast. Here's a quick anecdote. In Mizzen and Main's first 6 months, we made $30,000, right? It's a pretty successful company now. Tens of millions of dollars a year, does really well. In our first 6 months, we made $30,000. That's how slow we started. Parade went from nothing to, I want to say, 10 or $11 million in a year, right? Rowing Blazers went from 3 to 8 figures in a year. Thank you.
I thought wearing a shirt would be too much, but I did the hat. We'll try hard to be like, hey,
I like your style. I like your style. Yeah, there are a lot of those stories. Companies reaching 50 and 100 million annual revenue in 2-3. Snow, the teeth whitening company, is doing 9 figures. They started in 2019. This is what I mean. That's clearly an effect that COVID had on the consumer, but also there's just so much money. Not everyone, but people have so much money that they're indiscriminate with their purchases right now, and e-commerce is benefiting.
Speaking of Rowing Blazers, I'm really curious how a lot of legacy brands that are in the categories we're talking about are really shifting. And I think the Rolling Blazers example is an interesting one. So, for example, Brooks Brothers, even before the pandemic, was in a really terrible state. Bankruptcy, closing a lot of stores, all those issues. You have other brands like J Press or that aren't quite relevant. I'm not quite sure how successful they are because it's a East Coast thing. But I go on Instagram and all of a sudden I notice that Brooks Brothers is basically creating Rolling Blazers knockoffs, and J Press has all these rugbies that is not the Tweety J Press I saw back in college 10 years ago. And then, of course, you have Gap, right? The ultimate middle American mall company doing the Yeezy collaboration, right? So how, from your perspective, how do you rate legacy companies who've either had to start over due to bankruptcy or are just struggling along? How do you see them try to restart themselves by taking e-commerce insights and applying them to their companies?
Yeah, they'll take more than insights. They'll take the culture with it. I think the Brooks Brothers example was a good one. They straight up knocked Growing Blazers off. And, listen, Authentic Brands Group is the owner of them now, and they're masters of intellectual property. So they probably knew what they were doing. Yeah, I think that these legacy companies will do their best to try to incorporate as much culture and as much likeness as they can. You're seeing the same thing with Victoria's Secret. Victoria's Secret said, okay, we have Third Love and Adore Me and Parade and Thinks and Nix, and all these companies represent a certain class of founder and spirit, and generally speaking, obviously product category. Let's shut them down by completely, rejiggering our board and hiring Megan Rapinoe and a few others to reshape how our brand is perceived. Yeah, a lot of brands are going to do that because, like you said, these brands are climbing the ranks really quickly in both revenue and long-term viability. And the older guard has to take them seriously now. So they're willing to play the younger competitors' games just to stay relevant.
And what's interesting about a lot of these brands, and this is the what has changed dynamic, is if you can go from 0 to 7, 8, 9 figures in a 2 or 3 year period, the venture capital discussion gets totally different. So you're not needing to raise just this boatload of money and not quite have a model. So what do you think the ability to bootstrap to a certain degree, what does that mean for anyone launching an e-commerce company today?
I mean, that's the preferred method to me. I mean, I'm a proponent of bootstrapping. I do that with 2PM. I would have done that with Mizzen if I had my choice. The company that probably influenced me most was Rogue. And, they're I don't know, something like 1,300 employees. They never raised a dime. That's my spirit. It's also a very strong card to play when you're raising money if you ever want to. I think the founder of Nix, Joanna Griffiths, she said it best in a conversation that we had. I think we asked her, you raised $53 million, you're profitable, you're at like a 9-figure run rate. What are you going to do with the money? And she's like, we're going to invest it. But other than that, I don't know. Like, she doesn't have to have a strict plan because she's already a successful company, and she's going to find the best way to use that money on the timeline that makes the most sense for her. But unlike every other brand that raised that money before finding their footing, she has a lot less pressure.
Something I'm thinking about just as we're looking at the experience of exurbs, suburbs, malls, all of that, I'm curious what your thoughts are on just theaters and streaming.
Yeah.
Because a key part of that mall experience, 80s, 90s, early aughts that I'm thinking about, the movie theater was centric to all of it. Mm-hmm. So and it's not, obviously, I guess it kind of is e-commerce now because direct to video, streaming stuff. Like, what are your thoughts on that?
So, yeah. Fast 9 came out 4 days ago, right? 3-4 days ago. Not an ounce of me wanted to go see that in the theater. And I'm a fast and furious kind of guy. Like, they're entertaining. I don't have the desire to watch that in the theater.
Is that COVID? Is it lack of interest? Is it there?
No, it's
Is it
not
there's a new
COVID.
option?
It's not COVID. It's just, one thing that, you're in New York, right?
Yeah.
One thing that you know better than most living in New York is that the service industry is struggling. So any experience that we had pre-COVID, unless it's a premium experience, that experience now is a lot less than it was beforehand, right? And so you go to a traditional AMC theater, it's like the popcorn's going to be a little bit colder, the floor is going to be a little bit dirtier, the seats are going to be a little bit sketchier. It's going to take a long while for even the modestly nice experiences to catch up to what they were. Now, if it's like a nice theater like you find in, Orange County, California, or Miami, yeah, I would probably consider that. But there aren't very many theaters like that in Ohio. So there's a parallel. What we were saying about middle class retail is the same thing with these types of experiences. I'm much more inclined to wait and see it at home because of that. I think that over COVID, we've been trained to watch things at home. And as long as that continues to be an option, it's going to be a lot harder for movies like that to experience the same boom that they did before COVID.
Just to sum this all up, if we're looking at these bifurcating experiences, if you're in poverty, if you're wealthy, there's this dramatically underserved middle that we're talking about, not just geographically the middle of the country, but just a middle. What do you think the future of that market is? How do you think brands, something you've also written a lot about is influencers and individual creators are going to be able to drive adoption in ways they haven't been able to before. Yeah. How do you think that audience is going to get served?
Well, so there's two things. If you're a new brand, don't go for the middle, because I do believe that the middle is shrinking.
Could you define the middle real quick? So this could be useful. What does the middle mean?
The middle class is anywhere between $46,960 and $140,900, depending on where you live and how many people are in your household.
So you think that market, if you're new, you would not advise someone to start a new brand that's serving that market?
Well, you have to be prepared for a red ocean theory, right? A red ocean game plan of sorts. Just a lot of competition, both in old brands and new brands in that same space. And frankly, inflation, healthcare costs, childcare costs, work insecurity almost. I don't want to say people are just a lot less sure about their careers. All those things play a factor, right? So quickly, if the annual spend for that category is $38,000 to $49,000 a year, which is what that site says, or what 2PM says, it's Pew Research, by the way, then because of those rising costs in other sectors, it becomes maybe $28,000 to $33,000 in spend per year that's available to typical families. And so you're just competing with a lot of factors that most brand founders don't consider when they're getting a brand off of the ground. Whereas if you are appealing to the working class, you're always going to have an audience. And just like anyone, just like any American, they're going to want something that's quality enough at a reasonable price. That's how Walmart became Walmart, right? Whereas you look at Target, and Target's doing the opposite. They recognize that just like the working class, the wealth class is expanding. And a lot of people that were formerly in the middle class are expanding into that class. And they already have habits that they've, I guess, patterned themselves after because of their love of Target. So Target's like gone up market with a changing demographic.
Yeah, and you really see this when you think of all of those bullshitty D2C products are now in the pharmacy aisle. It's crazy. Everything that I get just blasts at me at Instagram. It just feels like it's in Target in some ways. You just see that bifurcation there. So let's end with this then. Looking at this picture, if I'm a founder in the e-commerce space, given your 3 to 5 year timeline, I feel pretty excited. But you said the broad way of thinking about this period is a period of optimism. And I'm not hearing a lot of optimism around that middle. So I'm not asking you to make a case against what you're saying, but
Well,
how would you yeah, please.
so optimism as a class, there's not. It's somewhat of a doomed class. There's just too many market forces that are hindering a lot of people in that class. I'm a father of two daughters. If we weren't upperly mobile over the last decade, my daughters would have struggled. I had to find a way to do better than I was 3 years ago and 4 years ago and 5 years ago, or I wouldn't have been able to afford life for them, right? That's because the middle class shrank. And a lot of the things that we depended on for the second half of the 20th century went away with it. Pensions, job security, the average job tenure is a lot shorter than it was in 1980 and 1970, so on and so forth. I am optimistic though for individual people, right? Like I'm a middle class kid. I'm middle class until I was in my late 20s. So I believe that a lot of people can leave that behind and sort of achieve that wealth strata on their own if they do the right things, whether it's through the dynamism of entrepreneurship or through re-education or even finding a vocation that's lucrative right now. Handymen are making $800 a day. You know, your plumber's making serious money. Your barber's doing $250,000 a year in some cases. Like there's opportunity everywhere. And those people are no longer quote unquote middle class, even if that's what we originally sort of depicted those roles as.
So that's actually the perfect pivot to my final question. And I know you get the how do you become a deep generalist question all the time. Mm-hmm. So I want to ask a very precise version of it. I'll link this in the show notes, but your end of 2020 book list with your recommendations was incredible. I got Paris 1919 because of it. There were a couple other really great books there. Everyone's read Shoe Dog, but I picked up Swoosh, which is there it is. It's a great, totally off the topics we discussed today, but it's a really great book. Margaret McMillan is great. Well, what I'm wondering is, how do you find the time to read? And it's not, because the whole point of deep general is it's not random, right? The point is, if we're read Paris 1919, if you're trying to understand what does a world look like when everything is shifting and a world order is crashing and you have figures and institutions trying to figure out what's coming next. I totally get it. That's very obvious. But how do you, as a creator who goes through the burnout issues, you're raising a family, you're launching companies, like how do you physically find the time to even find extra things? Because I think something that you get superficially is everyone says, hey, go read 0 to 1 or go read the obvious books that we all see. You should read if you're into tech or business. But once again, Paris 1919, that's not on anyone's list. So how do you do that, right? I'm serious. I've been so curious about this.
Yeah, I guess I can't speak for anyone else. I didn't grow up as someone that felt like they were smart. I think in middle school, I was considered smart. I was in National Junior Honor Society or whatever. Then I went to a Jesuit school for high school and just kicked my butt. Didn't feel smart in college either. So I would just say this. I'm intellectually curious. I want to understand things. I want to be able to project things. And like, I recognize that I'm not smart enough to maybe react to certain things, but if I can anticipate them, I can do pretty well, right? And so I really work on improving my anticipation. I still don't think that I'm an intellectually superior person, but I do think that I have two things that benefit all potential people that want to become deep generalists. And that again is curiosity, number one, and physical endurance. I don't sleep much. And I'm not glorifying that, but one quick anecdote is that my daughters sometimes say, are you like a stay-at-home dad? Because they don't actually see me do my work, mostly because I'm up until 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, making up for the time that I'm usually spending with them. So not to discourage anyone, but I probably get like 5.5 to 6 hours of sleep on a good day. And the rest of that day, 2 p.m. is no joke. It's my passion. And it's essentially monetizing what I would be doing anyway. And that is A, studying, B, trying to figure out the world so that I can boil it down for people that maybe don't have the time or energy to do that, which is what each newsletter tries to do. I believe that if you are intellectually curious at all and you have any sort of attention span, you can take the things that we find in the newsletter and the connections that you can make for yourself and really benefit from them. And I hope that eventually people see it that way and not as like a list of chores to read, I guess. So yeah, that's my take. History is important. Psychology is important. Sociology is extremely important. The humanities are vital. And so I try to balance out the bits and bytes of our industries with sort of the enrichment of the humanities.
Very well said. Well, Webb, thank you so much for joining us on the Deep End today.
Yeah, man. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thanks for joining us in the Deep End. If you enjoyed your stay, give us a review on Apple Podcasts and share this episode with your friends and colleagues to help grow the show with us. We've also got show notes and more episodes available at ideas.beyonddeck.com. See you next time.